World War II pushed aviation technology to its limits, producing legendary fighters and bombers that changed history. But not every aircraft was a success. Some were so catastrophically flawed they killed more of their own pilots than enemy combatants. From carriers that crews refused to fly to bombers that spontaneously combusted mid-mission, these 5 disasters prove that even in wartime, engineering hubris has deadly consequences. Buckle up, because what you're about to see will make you question how they ever left the drawing board. The Navy called it the Helldiver. Pilots called it the Beast. And they weren't being complimentary. When the Curtiss SB-2C rolled out in 1940 to replace the beloved Douglas Dauntless, the Navy expected a modern dive bomber that would dominate the Pacific. What they got was a flying nightmare that would take 3 years and countless modifications to become even marginally acceptable. The problems started immediately. The Helldiver was massively overweight, so much so that its handling characteristics were dangerous. It wobbled during carrier approaches like a drunk pelican. The hydraulic systems failed constantly, leaving pilots without working landing gear, flaps, or dive brakes at the worst possible moments. Engine fires were common. The tailhook had a disturbing tendency to bounce over arresting wires, sending multi-ton aircraft careening into barriers or worse, off the deck entirely into the ocean. But here's the real indictment. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher bluntly stated he'd rather have 1 squadron of the old Dauntless than 2 of Helldivers. Pilots despised it. Maintenance crews cursed it. Even after literally thousands of modifications, redesigned tail surfaces, new propellers, structural reinforcements, engine upgrades, the Beast never fully shed its reputation. Yet somehow, incomprehensibly, the Navy built over 7,000 of them. It became the most produced Allied dive bomber of the war, serving through 1945 and into Korea. The Helldiver did contribute to victories at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, eventually proving capable in the hands of skilled pilots who'd mastered its quirks. But that's damning with faint praise. It should never have taken 3 years and endless retrofits to make an aircraft combat-ready. The sickest irony? The Douglas Dauntless it was meant to replace had already won the Battle of Midway, arguably the most important naval engagement in the Pacific, and was universally loved. The Navy replaced perfection with problems, and pilots paid the price. If you think that's bad, wait until you see what happened when the Navy tried replacing their torpedo bombers. It went from bad to absolutely catastrophic. If you're enjoying this dive into aviation disasters, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more historical chaos coming your way. The Douglas TBD Devastator entered service in 1937 as the world's most advanced carrier-based torpedo bomber. By 1942, it had earned an unofficial nickname that perfectly captured its battlefield performance: the Flying Coffin. What happened in those 5 years was simple. The world moved on, and the Devastator didn't. When new, the TBD was revolutionary. All-metal construction, hydraulic wing folding, enclosed cockpit, and a semi-retractable landing gear. But aviation technology was evolving at breakneck speed in the late 1930s. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Devastator was hopelessly obsolete. Its maximum speed of 206 miles per hour made it a sitting duck against modern fighters. It carried virtually no armor plating. Its defensive armament was pathetic: 1 forward-firing .30 caliber machine gun and 1 rear-facing .30 caliber gun operated by the radio man. That's it. But the real killer was the Mark 13 torpedo it carried. This weapon was a catastrophe in its own right: unreliable detonators, poor depth control, and a tendency to simply not explode even when it hit. Pilots had to fly low, slow, and straight for miles to drop it, making themselves perfect targets. The Devastator's combination of obsolescence and faulty weapons created a death trap. The massacre came at Midway. On June 4, 1942, 41 TBD Devastators launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to attack the Japanese carrier fleet. What followed was slaughter. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire ripped through the slow, unarmored bombers like paper. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was annihilated, all 15 aircraft shot down, with only one survivor. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked that day, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo hit its target. The Devastator was immediately withdrawn from frontline service and replaced by the far superior Grumman TBF Avenger. None survived the war. But American aircraft disasters pale compared to what German engineers unleashed on their own pilots. Starting with a plane so unstable it earned one of aviation's most chilling nicknames. When Messerschmitt designed the Me 210 to replace the aging Bf-11-0, they created something far more dangerous than any enemy fighter, a plane that actively tried to kill its own pilots. The Me 210 looked promising on paper, faster, more maneuverable, better armed than its predecessor. The Luftwaffe ordered it into production before testing was complete, convinced Messerschmitt's reputation guaranteed success. That decision would prove catastrophically premature. The problems emerged immediately during test flights. The Me 210 suffered from violent, uncontrollable Dutch rolls, a combination of yawing and rolling oscillations that made the aircraft whip back and forth like a thrashing snake. Pilots described it as trying to fly a bucking bronco at 300 miles per hour. Worse, the aircraft had deep stall characteristics that made recovery nearly impossible. The rear fuselage was too short, creating aerodynamic instability that no amount of skill could compensate for. Crashes mounted. Experienced test pilots refused to fly it. Production pilots dubbed it the Widowmaker and demanded transfers rather than fly death missions in the Me 210. The Luftwaffe had committed to mass production based on promises, but what rolled off assembly lines was unflyable. Desperate fixes were attempted: tail extensions, lead ballast in the nose, redesigned vertical stabilizers. Nothing worked adequately. After numerous fatal crashes and only limited deployment, the Luftwaffe did something almost unprecedented. They scrapped the Me 210 program entirely and brought back production of the obsolete Bf-110 it was supposed to replace. The disaster wasted thousands of man-hours, precious materials, and, most critically, pilots Germany couldn't afford to lose. Eventually, Messerschmitt salvaged the design concept into the Me 410 Hornisse, which fixed most structural issues. But the Me 210 itself remains one of aviation's greatest failures, a plane so fundamentally flawed that its own air force gave up on it. And if you think that's the worst German engineering disaster of the war, just wait until you see what happens when you put 2 engines in the space of 1. Enjoying these engineering nightmares? Subscribe and stick around. We've got more historical disasters that'll make you appreciate modern safety standards. Germany needed a strategic bomber. What they got instead was an aircraft that spontaneously combusted with terrifying regularity. Meet the Heinkel He 177 Greif, optimistically named Griffin, but known to its crews as the Flaming Coffin. The He 177's fatal flaw was baked into its design from the beginning. The Luftwaffe demanded a heavy bomber capable of dive bombing, a ludicrous requirement that would compromise everything else. To meet the dive bombing specification while reducing drag, Heinkel engineers made a catastrophic decision. They coupled 2 engines together to drive a single propeller on each wing. Instead of a normal 4-engine layout, the He 177 had 4 engines crammed into 2 nacelles. The result was predictable disaster. The coupled DB606 and DB610 engines ran impossibly hot. Cramming two 12-cylinder engines into one compartment meant inadequate cooling, oil leaks pooling on red-hot exhaust manifolds, and fuel lines running through superheated spaces. Engine fires became routine. Crews reported flames erupting from the nacelles during takeoff, mid-flight, and landing. Some fires were so intense they couldn't be extinguished, forcing crews to bail out. Maintenance was a nightmare. Accessing anything required disassembling half the nacelle. Simple repairs took days. Reliability was abysmal. Mission abort rates exceeded 50%. Many He-177s never saw combat. They burned on the runway or broke down before reaching operational status. Germany poured enormous resources into this program. Over 1,000 aircraft built despite its obvious failures. Resources that could have gone to fighters desperately needed to defend the Reich instead went into a bomber that spent more time on fire than on target. When He-177s did reach combat, they were used primarily on the Eastern Front and anti-shipping missions, nowhere near the strategic bombing role they were designed for. The He-177 represents one of the great what-ifs of the Luftwaffe. If they'd simply built a conventional four-engine bomber instead of pursuing this over-engineered monstrosity, Germany might have had a credible strategic bombing capability. Instead, they got a flying bonfire. Think that's the worst aircraft of the war? There's one plane that killed more of its own side during training than it ever could have in combat. The Blackburn Botha holds a special distinction among World War II aircraft failures. It was so spectacularly useless that it killed more British airmen in training than it ever would have killed enemies in combat. The RAF had another name for it, the flying coffin, and they meant every word. Designed as a reconnaissance and torpedo bomber, the Botha failed at literally every aspect of its intended role. It was criminally underpowered, two Bristol Perseus engines that couldn't provide adequate performance even in ideal conditions. Maximum speed was a pathetic 249 miles per hour, making it slower than many fighters it would face. Worse, it couldn't maintain altitude on a single engine, meaning any engine failure was potentially fatal. The cockpit design was a masterclass in how not to build an aircraft. Visibility was terrible. Pilots couldn't see properly during landing approaches, leading to countless accidents. The controls were heavy and unresponsive. The Botha had a documented tendency to enter sudden, unrecoverable spins, especially during the slow-speed maneuvers required for torpedo runs. Trainees died regularly when their Bothas simply fell out of the sky. Here's the damning statistic. The Botha was withdrawn from any combat consideration almost immediately and relegated to training duties. Even there, it proved too dangerous. Crash rates were unacceptable. Maintenance demands were absurd. The aircraft contributed nothing to the war effort except filling graveyards. By 1943, the RAF had seen enough. The Botha was completely withdrawn from service, not replaced, not upgraded, just eliminated. Of the 580 built, not a single example survived. Nobody wanted to preserve this monument to engineering incompetence. No museum considered it worth saving. The Botha disappeared from history as thoroughly as it deserved. The saddest part? Every resource spent building Bothas, every hour of labor, every pound of aluminum, every pilot lost in training, represented capacity that could have gone toward aircraft that actually worked. In a war where Britain was fighting for survival, the Botha wasted resources the nation could ill afford. These 5 disasters prove that wartime desperation doesn't excuse engineering incompetence. From carriers that crews refused to fly to bombers that combusted mid-mission, each represents costly lessons written in pilots' blood. The Helldiver, Devastator, Me 210, He-177, and Botha remind us that good intentions and urgent timelines mean nothing without competent execution. Want more fascinating military history and forgotten disasters? Keep exploring our channel. We've got plenty more stories from the Heritage Planes archives that'll make you see history differently.